Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to Turning Users into Cybersecurity Allies, Pushing, Pleading, or Punishing, a session in the 2021 Omdia Analyst Summit, part of Black Hat USA. My name is Kurt Franklin. I'm a senior analyst in the cybersecurity practice at Omdia. Now, before we begin with this session, you should know a couple of things. One is that we're going to be looking at four different approaches to turning these users into cybersecurity allies. Now, one is not to be recommended, one is quite recommended, and two others fall somewhere in the middle. The other thing you should know is that there are going to be some statistics mentioned during this presentation. These are taken from the 2021 Dark Reading Omdia Insights survey, which concluded in July. So now let's move forward with our presentation. So turning users into allies is typically seen as something that an organization wants to do. Well, there are four broad approaches that can be taken. One is simply to ignore them. Now, in this particular path, employees really can't be turned into allies, not because they don't want to, but because they simply don't have the capacity. Now, they're not to be trusted. Even in the best of circumstances, they're just not very good at anything regarding cybersecurity. The only rational policy, therefore, is to treat users collectively as a massive vulnerability. Now, if you think that having your users be a cybersecurity ally is a good thing, this is obviously not the preferred path, but it's one that many companies still follow. Next comes the path of punishing. Now, in many cases, this starts with things that look quite benign audits, assessments, and tests. But in this path, the purpose of all of those is really to show employees just how bad they are at cybersecurity. When they are shown how bad they are, the response from the organization is to shame or punish them. And if, heaven help us, there should be some sort of cybersecurity incident at the organization, well, the first response is to try and affix blame and publicly punish the involved employees to the greatest extent possible. Next comes pushing the employees. Now, this is definitely a better path than punishing because training is the focus. Now, the training here often is where awareness training begins and ends because employees are trained to recognize dangers and respond to them, but respond primarily by avoiding them. The emphasis in pushing is to hammer into the heads of the employees just how dangerous the world is, just how bad communications from outside the organization can be, and last but certainly not least, just how terrible it can be should they fall victim to one of these nefarious plots that comes about and is shown through evil emails or websites. Finally, pleading the case of cybersecurity. Now, in this case, users are not trained as much as they are recruited. And here we must say, often this goes as a step past pushing. The training, the awareness is the starting point, but then the users are recruited into being allies. Obviously, as we see here, we consider this to be four steps along a progression toward the proper approach. Let's think a little bit about why we want to take this approach. After all, with all of the technology that can be brought to bear on cybersecurity, why do users matter? Well, most of us have heard this familiar triumvirate of process, technology, and people, although we typically hear it as people, process, technology. And there's a very good reason that people come first in that list and people are at the top of my little chart here. It's because of the critical importance of the people to the equation. After all, processes make use of people and support those people in getting their jobs done, and technology implements and supports the process. Put them all together, and you have rational security controls that actually make a difference and implement the cybersecurity of an organization. A lot of times you'll hear the employees referred to as being either one thing or another. But here at Omdia, we think of those users as being on a continuum. On the one side, we have the employee as well, just utter disaster. They come in, they know nothing. They, in the best case, stumble around blindly clicking on links, blindly opening every email that comes to them. And it's just a terrible situation. This is the untrained, unformed individual, if it's not even worse. There are people who assume that the employees come into the organization with nefarious intent, one way or the other. This view is where most organizations start thinking of their employees, and that is as disasters. So, next, they become aware. You train them to become aware, train them of what the dangers look like, what the threat landscape might look like, why people might want to get at all of the secrets that lie within the organization. Once they're trained to be aware of the dangers, they can become trained in how to respond to those dangers. In this stage, they become responsible employees who are doing no harm. But that's not as far as they can go. Past that, they can become allies where not just stopping at doing no harm, they are actually positive components in a successful and effective cybersecurity structure. Now, there are people who will say that there's a step beyond this, and that is the cybersecurity pro, and that's true, but realistically, you don't think about every employee becoming a cybersecurity pro any more than you think of every employee being a CPA just because they occasionally fill out a requisition to make a purchase. In most organizations, if you can help the employee make this journey from disaster through awareness to responsibility and finally to ally, you will have taken tremendous steps forward in improving your cybersecurity posture. So, what really goes into each of these steps? Well, in the disaster scenario, there's little training done because actors are unchangeable. Employees are simply vulnerabilities and threat actors from the day they walk through the door until the day they leave. They just don't have it within their capacity to change, even if they want to. Now, the response by the organization is one where a full arsenal is used against the user in the same way they use a full arsenal against outside threat actors. Zero trust, not only in the new sense of technology that helps prevent lateral spread of attacks, but genuinely not trusting anyone or anything is the core policy that lies at the heart of this view of the employee. Interestingly enough, one of the results of this is that productivity and employee resistance to IT or morale just aren't considered because it is assumed that they're going to simply have to deal with the cybersecurity structure that is put in place to guard the organization from them. I found it fascinating that more than 10% of organizations seem to be following this particular model because they have no training programs to help users become aware. Now, can this work? It can, but it doesn't work well from either a cybersecurity or an organizational efficiency standpoint. And that's why it really is important to move beyond this to look at the next set of possibilities, which is trainingment as punishment. Now, this is the old, you have to beat it into the employee, or to use another analogy, this way is all stick, no carrot. The goal here really is to begin by showing employees how bad they are at cybersecurity. If you can convince a person of just how little they know, you can convince them to be afraid every time they touch a mouse or a keyboard. One of the many problems with this is that when training does occur, it tends to be reactive. This type of path often uses existing breaches and cybersecurity incidents as the basis for training employees. See what bad thing just happened? And in order to get there, close employee monitoring is used as the basis, not just for legitimate purposes like regulatory compliance, but as the basis for punishment and blame to try and make the employees as paranoid as possible about the possibilities of failure. Now, in this, shaming, public punishment, up to and including dismissal, are fair game for the cybersecurity team. You know, Cybersecurity is important. And if someone has to be made an example of, well, that's just the price we pay for cybersecurity. Unfortunately, this leads employees to have a terrible, terrible impression of cybersecurity. And because it's reactive, 30% of companies say that they train largely or primarily in response to events rather than anticipating them. Well, how about the next step, pushing? In this case, employees are taught to recognize danger. And toward this, 45% of companies actually have annual training in cybersecurity, with many more doing additional training throughout the year to reinforce that training. Why? Because the dangers are always changing, and companies want the employees to recognize those dangers as they occur. Now, in this case, the emphasis is on breach and incident costs rather than individual blame for those costs. Now, with that said, those costs can and do include the possibility of job loss, whether it's a job loss tied immediately to being at blame for the breach or just because the impact on the business can be such that job loss is required. Now, this can be very effective, this coaching and pushing to deliver aware and even responsible employees. Thing is, for most employees, it won't take them to that final step to be true allies. For the true allies, the cybersecurity training program must plead the case of cybersecurity and talk about the positive benefits of better security. Security is not just the absence of bad things, it can have actual positive results. Now, it's a wonderful thing that more than a third of organizations, 36%, offer individual cybersecurity training where the individuals can be shown how those benefits accrue to their department, their function, and even their particular job. In this, users are trained to take positive cybersecurity steps, doing things like alerting the cybersecurity team to dangers and to perceived threats that may come. In this model, the users are an active part in the first warning level for cybersecurity. The nice thing is that when cybersecurity can be shown to be a positive thing for the organization, employees want to be allies. And this training can be effective in recruiting them to be cybersecurity allies, and as many employees think of themselves, cybersecurity champions. So, in the last few minutes, how do we get from here to there? What are some of the practical steps we can take to plead the case to the individual? Well, first of all, you have to know where you're starting to know which path you want to take. So some of these assessments can be very positive. Just don't tie them to shame and punishment. Make sure that your goals are meaningful and flexible. Those goals are going to vary depending on where you start, what your realistic goals are, and what the culture of the organization is for getting from place to place. Make a realistic plan for getting from here to there, and have that plan take into account enough time for the plan to be put into practice as it's being done. So measure your progress. This is going to be critical, not just for helping employees understand how they're improving, but in gaining support from the board and the executive suite. And it's important to tailor that training for individual users, making sure that every user is taken into account, not only for their differences in job role, but for their differences in learning style. One of the things that's important, though, is making sure that training and awareness are a priority. This can't be seen as something that they must do instead of their job. It's a priority and part of their job. That means, by the way, not penalizing them for actually taking the time to be thoroughly trained and brought into allyship. As you're doing this, keep the people at the center. All too often in this industry, we can put technology at the center of our training because it's so easy to be dazzled by the technology. Make sure your people are at the center of your training. Emphasize the collaborative aspect. Make sure that the carrot is much larger than the stick. Also, make it company wide. And by that, I mean not only every department, but every level of the company. We've seen too many cases where high level executives have become vulnerable because they were never trained. They were deemed too important to make aware. Make sure that they are trained. And here's a tip: make sure every employee knows that the executives are being trained. Finally, it's not just one and done. You can't say we're going to spend this week training and then we'll be done. It's got to be part of an ongoing company culture to keep abreast of new threats and to have the proper action and proper attitudes reinforced on a regular basis, whether this is through new classes or just, well, those posters in the break room that we all know and love. So, what have we looked at here? We've looked at taking users from vulnerability to ally, beginning with the step of ignoring them. We know that this is not the proper way to go, even though I think all of us can point to a company that we know of that takes this precise approach. Punish, letting the employees know that bad things happen to bad people and their victims. And oh, by the way, if you allow a cybersecurity incident, you're a bad person and you deserve whatever ill befalls you. We can push the screaming coach that brings out the idea that cybersecurity is the absence of attacks. So, cybersecurity is something that happens when you, as the user, don't make mistakes. It's a step, but not the final place we want to be. And finally, plead the case, making sure that everyone knows that cybersecurity is not just a negative, a lack of attack, but it's part of a successful business. Thank you for listening to this presentation. Thank you for being here. And now, through the miracle of online training and presentations, I'm here to answer your questions. So feel free to type your questions into the Q&A, and I look forward to the conversation.